completely lost everybody. You could tell how skilled I am. Oh boy. So today, could everybody turn off their microphones for the moment, just so we don't get too much additional sound. If you can just mute yourselves, that'll be good. So today I'm looking at death and dying and cultural aspects, and it's week 6 of our online course. And I'll be looking at different cultural beliefs about death and relevance for medical and healthcare practice. So the kind of topics I'll cover are expected death, concepts of good and bad death, active dying rituals that there are in some countries, and beliefs about after death and sudden death. What I'll look at next week is those experiences, near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. This is a painting by Raymond Douillet, and he's got all the fetuses coming in the timer and then leaving the timer as skulls. I particularly like his work. This is his as well, by the French artist, and he shows people being born, becoming toddlers, becoming adults, becoming smaller and smaller, and then going back into the womb of the earth and then coming round again. So I'm very fond of his paintings and the paintings of the ancestors. So I've asked this question, if anybody's had a bereavement, then if you find it difficult, if the kind of topics I'm covering, then do say so, do put it in the chat, because sometimes people may find it hard to cover this kind of topic. I've got the map. I like maps. I know I've shown this map every time I've given a talk, but I like it. It shows in West London where the actual population comes from, and you can see it's from United States, Canada, Central America, South America, Africa, South Africa, Australia, Southeast Asia, India. So this is the reason I felt we need to know what questions to ask when we're working with clients and with patients. And this is a snapshot I did from when I was teaching in Brighton in the medical school, because mostly these courses I designed and developed for hospital staff and medical students to raise awareness of different ways of understanding culture. And these are all the, this is a picture of all the translators just in Brighton and Hove. So you can see there is a need to know or to ask the question that there may be different ways of looking at things. And I was interested, how could a medical and healthcare professional's personal beliefs influence their conduct and communication with patients? Because some people say, oh, I haven't got a belief system, which is a very interesting thing to say. But the kind of things it would influence are end-of-life decisions, when there's advanced directives, when people particularly want to do religious rituals or carry out certain treatments. And I found that beliefs about death and dying are important, because so many people believe that an individual doesn't die with the human body, that there's some kind of consciousness that carries on beyond, which is also accessible while we're here. So there's also this importance that beliefs about the dead influence how people interpret mental health, and we'll look at that next week as well. So there's a strong belief that ancestors continue to exert an influence over living relatives, and that discarnate beings influence people's mental health. And I was working in East London, and the African and Asian population was 48.1%, and in northwest London the African and Asian population was 69%. So white, whatever the word white means, and it's extremely dubious, but the white population was 31% in northwest London. And what I found was, for example, in Redbridge, there was, when I was working there was a booklet that staff had done, like a directory, and it showed the kind of religions that staff could expect to have for local. There was information on diet and the care of the dying and post-mortem and concepts of organ donation as to whether people did or didn't like it. And there were contact details for specific faith communities and notes about coroners. And I just wanted to ask you, I'm going to stop the share for a second. Is anybody heard of anything similar where they're working? Is there any kind of spiritual care directory as they had in Redbridge? Would anybody like to share that? You can unmute yourself. Peter, would you like to say?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Yes, no, you just made me think. My dear wife passed away, well, in January of last year. Now, I live in Epsom in Surrey, where there's relatively small ethnic community. So she was attended by nurses from the Princess Alice Hospice in Esher. But I'm just pointing out something. Where I live in this area, there are very, very few immigrants. So in the hospice, you had an Anglican chaplain and also a Jewish one. I think there might have been also a Muslim chaplain there, but relatively it's an all established white British community. I just mentioned that in contrast to your question. Okay, thank you. And would you like to say what ethnicity your wife was? Yes, my wife was from Persia, Iran. She was not a Muslim, she was a Baha'i, yes. All right, thank you, Peter, thank you. Yes, I'll talk about her funeral later. All right, we will come to funeral, thank you. Would anybody else like to share about the kind of provision for dying people in the area that they live?
Yeah, I would love to share.
Okay.
Hello, do you hear me?
We can hear you.
I'm Sekwa Yusuf from Kampala, Uganda. This is East Africa.
Okay, nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, wonderful. So I would introduce myself professionally as an African spirituality high priest. And to a certain degree, in African sense, is engaged in a more profound and deeper notion in regard to being, to a certain degree, a graduation. So the preparation, what probably the coroners to that side of the world, and the post-mortem. It is to prepare someone's path to become triumphant, to conquer into the other afterworld. I'm fascinated that although down this way, I mean in the southern hemisphere, our notion see on death is engaged with a higher degree of fear. It is very rare to find an open discourse on this subject matter, although within our beliefs, which are largely original, death is a graduation to a higher level of human growth. My interjection to a question you asked, that are there some other people, because I don't have a medical background, where probably I'll be qualified to throw some light on what happens when as an occupational hazard amongst medical practitioners, rather health practitioners. What I would add, or I want to emphasize on this point, is that mental health, and to a certain degree.
Well, Yusuf, we won't be looking at mental health so much this week, but we will next week if you can join us there. Would you care to make some comments in the chat on the clip can be found on the bottom line, because sometimes we can hear you and you're coming in and out, but I'd be really interested in what you have to say. If you can write some notes in the chat, that would be great, thank you. And then do come in later, because I give some examples from Africa. So thank you, Yusuf, for sharing.
Okay, well, welcome. By any chance, would it be fair for me to ask, because I was invited in by Joel Bethlehem, something. I have a problem with pronouncing. Is he online now?
Joe is here, yes.
Is he here? I say hi to him. Is he hearing me? My question is Joe participating right now? Because I'm having a problem with identifying other members who are participating. I tried to find out, but it seems my gadget is not that much adequate. It doesn't give me all the options. And I'm sorry, I'm getting off track perhaps.
That's okay. Yusuf, would you and Joe like to hold a conversation on the chat? That could be very helpful. Would you do that, Jack?
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, Joe is my inspiration, and I'm a kind of a shy person, and he has pushed me and he has inspired me and say, you know, we are a family. Your contribution in any way can be relevant to some of us. So I'm glad to know that he's around.
I'm glad he invited you, and you can hold a conversation with him. So that's very kind of you for joining us. Thank you. Now, Joe, do chat with Yusuf as well. I'm going to carry on. Thank you for giving the examples, Peter and Yusuf. We're going to look a bit about managing deaths, because in the UK there was a time when corpses were hidden from everyday life in the hospices, the hospitals and cemeteries, and images of corpses were censored from media reports of actual events involving death. So many people go through life without ever witnessing a dead body. And I'm wondering, do people have examples of censorship and death in the West? Has anybody got examples of where they've not been allowed to see a dead body? I remember when my grandfather died that my sister and I weren't allowed to see him. So there was some kind of fear, whereas I know when I worked in India, people were laid out and they could be seen and visited by everybody.
Natalie, I've got an example.
Okay.
It was in the 70s, so it was quite a while ago. When my father died, it was a time where children sort of weren't involved in sort of discussions around death, and I actually wasn't. I didn't go to his funeral, because it was the thing to do in them days. So for years and years, I wondered where my father was buried, and actually only till I was sort of later on when I had a discussion with my mum. She told me that he wasn't buried, he was cremated. So I didn't have that closure. And I know things have sort of changed in terms of sort of, you know, young people being able to go to funerals, etc. But that was quite a sort of pinpoint for me, not being able to sort of say goodbye to my dad.
Yes, and it's very challenging, and it's what they call complicated grief now. Yeah. But there's not so much acknowledgement that this is what we cause by our own, that the adults' fear of death. Yeah. Didn't allow the children closure, whereas I believe in India and in Africa it's normal to see the body.
I mean, to be honest, sorry, I think it's the worst things that it's probably the worst thing you could ever experience as a human being, to see loved ones go. And I remember my grandmother when she passed away, and there was an opportunity to see her, and I wish I didn't, because she was like in this box and she was stone cold, like to touch, and it was just like that image of her in the box, just like yeah, I just find it yeah, it was a tricky one, that one. So that I rather remember her with the life that was in that body. That the body was just she had gone somewhere else, and it was like someone left their clothing. I was just looking at the clothing, you know, and I mean, she was in my memory. She was in our hearts, basically. That was. But to see the clothing that she was in was it was an image that sort of keeps repeating in my head. Listening to this session now, it sort of brings up stuff, and it's like, oh, that was the last image of my grandmother who kind of brought me up, you know. So yeah, it's a strange one, that one.
No, so she wasn't there. I remember my cousin who's a GP, and he worked as a hospital doctor, and his mother died shortly after my mother, about 10-12 years ago, and he couldn't work out what had happened, and he'd been working with death and dying people. That was his career when he worked in hospitals, and he ended up coming up to my front door because he couldn't work out, where did she go, what happened? Because there's clearly an absence of something, isn't there? When
yeah, it was just like she's yeah. So I kept looking at old videos of her and photographs, but looking at her body, it was like I was just looking at clothes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It was just like
yeah.
Oh, she was cremated, and then. Also, yeah, I think that this whole thing about death is kind of like almost an illusion in itself, maybe. I don't know. It's kind of,
when we
I think when I go, just get. I heard there's this. I saw it online. There's this kind of when you this funeral service where when you die that they turn you into fertilizer, and then put a tree so that you can carry on as the tree. I like that idea.
I'm not sure if it's accurate that you carry on as a tree, but it's one way of thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and then
way of thinking.
And it's giving back to the earth. I think that's what, on an ecological, every person that comes in, and then every person that comes out should leave a tree. should a continuation. Basically, I like that idea. We just carry on as a tree.
Yeah, we'll look at that next week as well, Craig, when we'll look at what people believe happens after death. Okay. When I was teaching at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, I taught first with a GP, Dr. Liz Archer, and at the time she did a review of the medical literature, and I'll just give an overview here. They looked at the Oxford textbook of medicine, and death appeared in every section, but there was no section or chapter heading for death and dying, except for palliative care. And there wasn't any entry for death in any standard medical textbook or any text on physiology or biochemistry. So there was lots of information on palliative care. There wasn't any discussion on what's the nature of death itself. So maybe things have changed now.
Well, it's birth, isn't it?
Sorry?
The nature of death is birth.
Yeah, but that's like the picture, that French painter that he showed, the cycle of how we come round. But there did seem to be a taboo on talking about death, and the kind of things people discussed were the kind of funeral that they wanted, whether there was a will or not, and how they would like to die and where they would like to die and what kind of support people wanted. And until the mid-20th century, most people died at home, and death was accepted as part of everyday life. And the doctor's task was seen as preserving life. So there was a while in our history when death felt as if it was a medical failure. And death became like the elephant in, what's happened here? I got ahead of myself. Death became like the elephant in the room. And what's confusing is when somebody's dying, they may know that death is imminent, but people around them are afraid to say so. So with burial, it was a sideline of carpentry, and then funeral directors provided a commercial services, and it took control of the events away from people and their family. And in the early 20th century, people washed and laid out the body at home, and people watched over it and viewed it, and people paid their final respects. But by the late 20th century, professional undertakers had taken control, laid out the body, and arranged viewing and burial. And we mentioned last week the books of Sue Brain and Peter Fenwick, When You're Nearing the End of Life, a guide for relatives and friends, and then End of Life Experience, Care for, guide for carers and the dying. And the kind of conversations people had around death was, this was from Sue Brain's book, Do You Think God Really Exists? So you could open a conversation. Do you believe there's life after death? Are you frightened? What are your fears? What can I do to help you at the moment? if there's ever a time that you want to talk, do tell me. So there's kind of questions you could ask. Does anybody have experiences of when people died, of this kind of spiritual encounter, where the body seems like an empty envelope? That's what you said, Craig, the body was just the clothes, but relatives may feel grief or numb, or people want to be alone with the body. Does anybody have any comments that they'd like to make on having witnessed a death? I know it's a sensitive subject. Georgie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I know when I saw my dad's body for the last time, although I knew he wasn't there, he was actually had like a very happy smile on his face. And I remember being quite surprised and shocked at that. And I was like, oh, like he actually looked happy in a way, although his passing was extremely traumatic. And I remember that being like a shock, because I thought, you know, it's just tragic or whatever it might be. So I think there's definitely something around, and, you know, people say just before people leave their vessel, their body, like euphoric experience. And yeah, so I just wanted to note that, because I thought it was very warming to see that actually he did look very happy when he left, that was left in his body. Yeah, there was a smile. And I think I heard the other day, actually, was it Steve Jobs, that his famous last words were, "Oh wow," as if, you know, like as he's, and I quite like Ram Dass's expression as well of leaving the body. But yeah, so it was a shock in the opposite way as to what I perceived, because maybe what I've, you know, been told about dying, and, you know, but yeah, that's that.
Oh, thank you. That's good. Yeah, some people can see different things. Alessandro, do you want to say something?
Yeah, a little contribution. I feel inspired because I always experienced, I grew up in a Tibetan Buddhist context environment. So like the experience of death was seen as one of the greatest opportunity. People is training all life to be aware in the moment of death and maybe direct the consciousness, etc. And I was, by living in this context, when I grew up in Rome, so when seeing what
Alessandra,
was...
can I ask, have you got a radio on?
Radio?
I can hear multiple noises.
I don't know.
Okay.
Now?
Yeah,
it's
okay. It's better.
And so by growing in this environment, I could leave a contrast when I went outside. In Rome, you know, there is mainly a Catholic background. So people suffer a lot. They have this unsolved problem. It's an unsolved material, the relationship with death. That for some culture is the thought that help you living at your best, and for some other is something not accepted, even though they claim, I believe in God. Okay. And then the moment you are born, you know you have to die, and you know everything is under his control, and you don't accept like what God is doing, for example. So this to say that there, like I always live the experience of death in a very beautiful way. When my mother passed, when my kind of stepfather passed, I was there, and really was a very beautiful spiritual experience.
Thank you.
And we need some element in our culture. We need some element in our culture to give people opportunity to see from a different perspective. That's all.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Would anybody else like to share?
Yes, if I may. Oh, sorry. Krishna was first. Krishna put her hand up first.
So, yeah. What I wanted to say was, it just reminded me that probably the first body I saw was when I was only age 6, and my 4-year-old brother died because I come from Hinduism or Hindu belief system, where we do bring the body home. I think, you know, many cultures do that. And he was brought, but I've also been, I've been a nurse. So I'm a former nurse, so I've seen quite a lot of, in the 15 years career, and thought a lot about it. And it was interesting. Was it Craig who was saying about clothes changing? That's how we are brought up in Hinduism. The belief system is that it's like changing clothes. So it's interesting. Just wanted to say that. And I think I've had the privilege perhaps to think about it since I was probably 17 or 18, and I first saw in the hospital settings. It was a shock initially to do all the, what they call last offices, but at the same time, it was also very much a privilege to be able to do that for the relatives, and that I'll always remember it as a very tender, very, very sympathetic, empathetic exercise that you actually do. And I'm very proud of the fact, the way I was, because the first time I was taught, I'll always remember that still. It takes me back to that when a senior student nurse took me with her and really asked me if I was okay to come and see, and I said yes. And so gently she taught me. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Krishna. Thank you. Peter, what did you want to say?
Yes, I had trained with a Dr. Roger Woolger as a past life regression therapist. So in that training, you take the person to the physical death and then out of the body to see, then they can look back at their body. So also I trained with Andy Tomlinson in the life between lives, which is the Buddhist concept of the bardo, where you are, the domain that you, where you are between lives. So I have a very strong belief, well, even an awareness, I would say, of the spirit, call it the spirit world. Also, I trained with Dr. Alan Sanderson in spirit release. Now, my wife had a very, very firm, strong belief in the spirit world, the continuing of the soul beyond the physical death. Now, she'd been very, very ill for a long time before she passed away. That was on the 11th of January. And because of that, I hadn't been able to meditate, but it happened for 3 successive nights before she passed away. I suddenly had because she was in hospital at St. Hilliers, and I suddenly had a period of absolute peace and tranquility, and knowing the concept of the psychopomp, person that has the facility to assist the person's soul to depart from the body at death. So particularly the third night, 3 nights and 2 nights before she passed away, I had this feeling, absolute tranquility. So with mental imagery, I had imagined my soul interacting with my spirit guide, high spirit guides in the spirit world, coming to assist my wife's soul to prepare it for her departure, because she knew then, the doctors knew, that death was very, very imminent. But then on the Friday, she had a procedure, and then it doesn't matter what the procedure was, but the next morning when I went to the hospital, they said they didn't expect her to live beyond the weekend. That was on the Friday. But also on those 2 nights that I've described to you, when I went to the hospital to see her, although she was most of the time just sleeping, I spoke to her, whispered, to tell her that, well, she knew that her life was very near the end and she wanted to pass anyway. So I said, and a lot of these concepts I got from Alan Sanderson, Andy Tomlinson. So I told her that the time was right for her to leave the body, for her to pass to the spirit world. And as she slipped away, there would be perhaps lights coming to her that might be her one of her ancestors who was coming to assist her soul, her spirit, to leave the body. Yeah, but I mentioned my wife was a Baha'i, so there is the concept there, the Abha kingdom, which means the kingdom of light that she would pass into. And on the very night that she died, when I was with her till about 8 o'clock, exactly the same thing. I gave her, spoke to her that the time was now ready for her soul to leave. And again, as she slipped away from this physical life, perhaps one of her ancestors would be there to greet her. And after I went home on that particular night, at just about 11 o'clock, when I know it was just about 11 o'clock, within a minute or two, I went into the bathroom. Again, I suddenly had this feeling of great peace and tranquility. And I had an image of her face. And then I had an image of, I knew it was an Egyptian coffin or sarcophagus, black with white writing on it. And then the word came to me of parchment, which is really the skin of an animal where the life has actually gone. I had all those three images.
Yeah.
And then the next morning, when the hospital phoned me to say she'd passed away, when I went to the hospital and I asked what time she'd passed away, they said 11 o'clock. Exactly.
So you knew?
Yes.
So you knew. Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for sharing that, and everybody who shared. So there can be so many touching stories and knowing when somebody passed. And I had an experience when my mother died, that we did a vigil, and then on my watch, 5 o'clock in the morning, one of the nurses knocked on the door, and my attention went to the door, and my mother stopped breathing as soon as even though I was inviting her to leave because she'd had enough. So thank you for sharing though, because as you say, as you've just said, Peter, relatives may describe a loving, light-filled room or strange phenomena, and people knowing. So Peter, you got ahead of me there.
Sorry.
You got ahead of the slide. So people can sense the time of death before being officially informed. But these kind of things are comforting and never forgetting. Can I ask if there's anybody who hasn't spoken who'd like to, what do you consider are the principles of a good death? Would anybody like to make a suggestion? What do you think are what would you like for yourself, the principles of a good death?
Just say something.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Margaret. Yes.
Hello.
We can hear you. We can see you.
Yeah. I'd like to share something. Oh, good. I'd like to share something. When the last time I saw my father was at an airport. I was leaving to another country, and my mother doesn't like to be alone ever, and my father knew that, and he was sick. He was getting sicker and more feeble, and he didn't like to look in the mirror and see his feebleness, because he'd rather be whitewater rafting or climbing mountains, but his body was not. he had pulmonary fibrosis. If he had lived long enough, he would have died a terrible death. But anyway, I saw him last, and I told him if my mom left before he would, I would stay with him, and if he left before my mom, I would stay with her. And so we said goodbye, and we always had a tradition of just waving, and you go farther and farther into the airport, and we wave and we wave until you think you're not, and then you turn around and there's my dad. And that was the last time I saw him. I went to Guatemala, and about a week later, I got a phone call from my sister that something terrible had happened. And I was, oh, what happened? And she said, Dad died. And I was like, well, why is that terrible? That was my thought, because he had been eating less and less, and he had a beautiful, rich life of travel and doing what he loved and climbing mountains and sleeping under the stars with us, with 500 sheep looking at us in the morning. I mean, it was his time to go. But the family's, oh, you know, he died. Okay, and I couldn't get back. My passport expired. I didn't make it to the big funeral, thankfully. I made it the next day for a small funeral, or for a small celebration of life with about 200 homeless men who he served for about the last 20 years of his life. So that I was comfortable there, but not in these big fancy things. But what happened with me is I lived with my sons and my parents in this home. And my younger child was born here. And my sister descended upon the home, and they had no idea of thanatology, that you don't move things. One sister started organizing things, and wherever the scissors used to be, the pencils were, and they got rid of all his clothes, even his glasses that to me were like a relic. And it was pretty terrible, strange.
But did that cause additional grief, that things were moved around? And not...
Well, yes, it caused a lot of confusion, because of course they thought, well, I had lived here with my folks for 20 years at that time. My son was born here, it was our home, but they had the right to be here. And it was very strange, because I was living my own experience of his departure. And what the last gentleman said, I felt, I was swimming down at the pool, and I could feel the spirits come and take him about after 3 days. I could feel that, but I didn't say that. But I did make 2 altars. I made an altar to him, and with his photographs and flowers and roses and petals. I just did this instinctively. And then I made an altar for my sons, because he had passed away and they were coming up. And my family thought it was insane. They thought I was acting very strangely. And they got, it was terrible, because now I talk with my mother, we're very close. But after that, anyway, we're close now. The whole thing sparked a spiritual emergence, because they had asked us, a volunteer, to come and check on us. And she's in here praying the rosary with my mom, and she wanted to speak with me, but I didn't want to. I wanted her to, when I was down at the pool. I said, no, please respect my mourning. And then I came upstairs, and I wanted to go on the balcony and sing a song. And this song was just so powerful in me. And it was, I wanted to go on the balcony because my song was too powerful. I didn't want to sing it. And this woman thought that I wanted to jump off the balcony. So her perception started off a terrible series of events.
So the whole knock-on effect after your father died of people interpreting your behavior in different ways.
Well, exactly, because they had no perspective, no vantage point, no knowledge of what to do. And later, the book, Stan Groff's book, I read in there about the altars. Of course, people make altars. My mother's Mexican, of course, but at the moment I wasn't thinking about it. I was just doing it for my own, from my own need. I didn't know. So we had no cultural preparation, and they thought, everything I did, they thought was crazy, and so it escalated and it got terrible. But and it's because there is no talk about it. And
Yeah,
we,
thank you, Margaret. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's really sensitive. I'm really grateful that you did. I'm just wondering, has anybody else had an experience like Margaret where you weren't understood?
Yeah, I mean, the question actually that's on my mind is dying before you die. I mean, that's a process that I think that I went through, that I did go through actually. I'm curious as to if anyone else has gone through that experience of dying before your physical death. That's the question that is high up on my list of questions that I want to get to know, because I think that's also an important rites of passage. Because when I went for a death-like process, I got shoved into Never Never Land. You know, I'm kind of sorry, but anyway, I won't go into that.
But are you coming next week? Because that is.
Oh, have I jumped the gun again?
You got ahead of yourself again.
I'll read it back in. But yeah, that is. So I'll save that question for next week then.
Yeah, yeah, because we will look at these experiences of after. Thank you. Would anybody like to make another comment, or shall I continue?
just a quick thing, there is a book you're probably familiar with called Being Mortal, and it's written by a physician from India, and he was shocked about how in the Western modern world everything is about keeping the body technically alive, and there is no preparation, there's no honoring the departure. And this book is now circulating around people my age whose parents are passing away. Being Mortal, because we need to bring honor back to the departure, instead of everybody plugged in and you know, this hysteria of keeping the organs moving along instead of the honoring. Anyway, that was just what I wanted to say.
No, that's great. Could you put it in the chat box and then other people can see it? What is it called? Being Mortal?
It's called Being Mortal.
Yeah.
And
okay.
so he came from India, and here at first he just observed it, and then he thought, no, I have to write about this. This is important. It's not. It's anyway. I can't remember the author, but you'll find it. It's called Being Mortal.
All right. We shall search on it. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Alessandro. You just said you're disappearing, but thank you for being with us. So the top 5 regrets of the dying are: I'd wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. And I wish that I had let myself be happier. So this was a survey done by nurses, Krishna. So,
okay. Thank you.
So the principles people said of a good death: to know when death is coming, to be afforded dignity and privacy. And I think it's also to be aware of the book that Margaret mentioned, to be aware of different ways of interpreting death. So to have control over pain, relief and other symptoms, to have a choice when death occurs, and to have access to hospice care, and access to spiritual or emotional support, time to say goodbye and control who is there, and be able to issue advance directives, and to be able to leave when it's time to go, and not to have life prolonged. And I think that book that Margaret mentioned is essential if we're going to go into a new way of being with people who died. I've got a few examples from India about what's a good death. And these were taken from the book by Jonathan Parry, Death in Benares, where he did research where it was famous for dealing with death, where pilgrims go to the banks of the River Ganges to cremate their loved ones, served by priests and specialists. And the aim of the post-cremation rites was to convert the ghost of a deceased into an ancestor to help them achieve the journey to their final resting place. So there was much more awareness of beyond, of achieving a good state after death. Shanty funeral services, in case anybody's interested, is in North Harrow. It's my closest funeral service. One of the things that Sri Aurobindo said was the soul's journey after death. That at the time of death, the being goes out of the body through the head. It goes out into the subtle body and goes to different planes of existence for a short time, and until it has gone through certain experiences, which are the result of its earthly existence. Afterwards, it reaches the psychic world, where it rests in a kind of sleep until it is time for it to start a new life on earth, if it is going to. I've met so many people who've said, I don't want to come back, this is my last time. Let me sort out my karma now so I don't return. So one of the things Sri Aurobindo said, that consciousness by its very nature is immortal, and in order to manifest in the physical world, it assumes more or less lasting material forms while it's here. And these were death rituals by Muslim people. To Allah we belong, and to him is our return. And it was considered important because it's a time of spiritual advancement. So death is seen as the pinnacle of a person's religious journey. And on death, a person's eyes are closed and their jaws are secure shut. It's a religious requirement that the body be rigidly washed and draped before burial, and burial should be as soon as possible after death. And I went to one mosque in India, Nagaur Mosque, where the Saint Hazrat Sayyid Muhammad Yusuf was born, and he was said to perform miracles even as a fetus in the womb. And then when he left his body, his son repeated prayers above his grave, and he was heard to reply from the tomb. And then in 1570, a thatched roof was put over the grave, and then offerings began to arrive, and then a domed roof was built. And today the mosque has a huge footprint over the land, and it's attended by people of all faiths, not just Muslim. And I also went to look at Hindu rituals for the dead. This was a place at Rameshwaram in India, where rituals were conducted for mental peace and closure after bereavement. And thousands of pilgrimage go there to bathe in the sea at sunrise. And the priest sits here and says prayer for these the three brothers who have shaved heads, and they have a little ceramic pot containing the ashes of their relatives. And the eldest son put the pot of ashes on his head and walked into the sea, and then gave the pot to the water, followed by garlands of flowers. And at the time, the brothers stood in prayer and undid their white cloths and allowed the sea to take it, and ducked themselves completely under the water. And this concept of a Hindu state of samadhi, when a religious person realizes it's time to die and refuses all food and water and meditates until death. And this was Sri Chandrasekharendra Saraswati, and he attained samadhi in 1994 at the age of 100 years, but it was a chosen ritual when they knew, people knew they were going to die. And the similar thing in Africa, although Yusuf has left us now, but this was the Dinka of Sudan, where an elder man chose an active death, and the relatives dug a pit in the cattle byre, and he was laid on a wooden bed, lowered into the grave, where hymns were sung, and people stayed to hear his prophecies until he was silent. And then they closed the pit, and they said that was a good death because it was chosen, he knew he was going, hymns were sung, and he gave prophecies. And then we look at closer to home, corporate death, with what we've seen in the news in the last few weeks, with the death by the police of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and it triggered many people, and it has started to trigger change in the way people understand being Black. And in America is a problem. My voice seems to be going, interesting. It's a problem of Black African American people and also Indigenous American people. And this is a photo of Chukwuemeka Maxwell, who's in Totnes in the UK. And he said, I was born a Negro, then I became coloured, now I'm Black. And he notes the number of deaths in custody that we have in the UK and in psychiatric hospitals. There was a situation in Australia with Aboriginal deaths in custody where land rights were ignored. In Canada, there was stolen land of Black and Indigenous people. There's too much stop and search. All this is coming up. There seems to be something coming to the surface now, so that we look at how we other people, how we make them other, and we don't see them as one. Got the last few slides now. Did notice that doctors choose to live differently. They're aware of all the medication and all the treatments, but they do, 64% of them do advance directives saying how they would like to die if they get sick. And what's unusual about them is not how much treatment they get compared to most Americans, but how little treatment, because they know exactly what's going to happen. They know the choices. They know they've got access to any kind of medical care, and they choose to die. They choose to had enough. I've got, I hope it's not sensitive for people with direct experience. I've got a couple of slides about sudden death, where people commit suicide. In the UK, it's around 6,000 people a year, 1,500 women and 4,500 men. Particularly young men commit suicide. The reasons can be very complex, usually a single trigger, though there may be a last straw. And it can include physical illness, alcohol, drug abuse, isolation, money and job problems. It can be something like a final straw that makes people kill themselves, the end of a relationship, or debt, or losing a home, or a deeply emotional event. And it can be single men and women who've never married, or people who are divorced or widows, apparently much more likely to commit suicide. Whereas if you have faith, it appears to reduce the risk of suicide. In many faiths, suicide is not acceptable, and people with strong religious beliefs may have more supportive social networks. But in England and Wales, 140,000 people attempt suicide every year. So it's quite shocking. I liked this image of the superficial face that a person has and what they're actually going through, the photograph. And for many people, intentional death can be very painful for those left behind, for the people who have to deal with it and cope with it. Makes for a complicated grieving process because people don't understand why. And the common feelings, as well as sadness and bereavement, are guilt at not recognizing the problem, or sometimes often anger at the suicide person, anger that they've left. And why is it important to talk with patients and with clients to find out what their spiritual and religious beliefs are, cultural interpretations of symptoms and beliefs about the end of life? And also the cultural beliefs influence the way that symptoms and experiences are understood. For example, the example that Margaret gave is that she wasn't understood in the way that she reacted to her father's passing. We need to know about the access to end-of-life services and the religious rituals. And this underlying assumption is people have different ways of understanding human existence and death. They have different ways of understanding. And this question is, why do we devote so much attention to understanding death and dying? Why do we devote so much attention to death and dying? Would anybody like to comment on that? Why are we interested?
Because life's so precious.
Say it again.
Because life is so precious, we want to cling on to. I think that's, and then so that we have to obviously. Well, it's been my quest is to understand what death is. You know, I think because I love life so much, and I don't want it to end. So that's been my. I forgot what the question was again.
Why do we devote so much time to trying to understand death and dying? What is the curiosity? Would anybody?
Because we all know that we're going to die at some point, so we want to know what's going to happen. And we want to believe that maybe there's something after.
Yes, and we will look at all those people's beliefs about afterwards next week. We really will.
Maybe this is the afterlife. Maybe we're all dead. Sorry. I mean,
we got ahead of ourselves.
I'll reel it back in.
Yeah, it's because we don't know. But then who claims to know? What about psychics and mediums and clairvoyants and shamans?
I think when I sorry, it's me again. It's nature. When I look at nature, I don't see. I see the cycle of life and death. I see a cloud. It disappears. It goes back into the sea, and then it evaporates. It becomes it's like a kind of. Have I jumped the gun again? I'm doing it again, aren't I? But it's when I suppose when I look at nature, I don't. That's it. Because I see myself. We're an extension of that. That's what you are. What you are looking at yourself when you look at nature and the universe. That doesn't. That's just a continual. I'm going to shut up now.
But yes, you've had experiences of beyond, and there may be other people who've had experience. But this is what we'll be looking at next week, beliefs about survival beyond death, and those who can and can't. So,
but what forced me was, I mean, I was very suicidal for a long time. I was a suicide. That last slide that you showed with the face, I put on I'm a master at wearing a disguise, you know, and I went to what's his name? The guy that was on the slide, the suicide prevention guy. With glasses, black guy. That was on one of the 2 slides back. Chuka Maxwell. That's where I met Chuka Maxwell.
Yeah.
Because I went to his suicide prevention thing because I wanted to help people going through the process, and I discovered that actually they were talking about suicides and how often, you know, when people think about it, and I'm like, well, I think about it nearly every day. I thought, no, I seriously think about it. That's why I find it difficult going near trains, because I've got this impulse to jump in front of it. but I understand why. It's because my mind is running so fast. But also, my granddad also, they believed he committed suicide. So it's been a kind of, I mean, I think I've sort of gone through a process where I kind of like had to die in my own little ritual. I did a sort of funeral to myself in a weird way.
Yeah, so, but you had somebody in your family who.
Yeah, my grandfather, my dad, and everyone says that's. My grandmother says you're the spitting image of granddad. You know, the way you walk, the way you look. You've got the same hairline. And he killed himself in front of the train hit him. It was an accident, but I think it was suicide.
Well, thank you, Craig, for sharing that. While you've been talking, Michael's been putting up things from suitable things about. Michael, thank you for joining us. Would you like to just say what you've been putting in the chat box?
Sure. Hey everybody, sorry I was a little late. But yeah, I had the privilege to join a training some years ago that is by the folks in Massachusetts, which is in the first link, the Western Massachusetts learning community up there, and then they covered the whole part of Western Massachusetts, sort of a rural area. And I don't know if they innovated it, but the approach, the alternatives to suicide is often there's so much stigma associated with even discussing suicide, or only maybe to the degree that it becomes a crisis that's at a critical stage. And the ways that it's discussed can often be very medical or clinical, you know, like asking a kind of battery of questions. You know, are you going to hurt yourself? And, you know, do you have a plan? Do you have means? And it can be sort of dehumanizing in the sense that here someone is in crisis, and the only thing, you know, and I think in the West, you know, the only thing the conversation is framed around is stopping the person from completing the act, whereas if it's sort of shifting the focus to the pain or what the person is experiencing, and even exploring what would that mean to you, like if you were to complete that, what do you think you would gain, and often that it's a sort of a distress signal or sign in people's lives, and to not try to dissuade people. And I think in giving the model, the tools, and sort of giving people the space to talk about it freely, it's not met with resistance or pressure, which often, medical or clinical approaches can do. So yeah, just invite people to look into it if you haven't encountered it. I had not encountered it, and even several years into doing peer work, and just had like a very refreshing take, helping people. It's probably parallels with like spiritual emergency, helping people make meaning of their own crisis through their cultural lens, not through a medical lens or, you know, some chemical imbalance per se. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. And Gaynor, thank you, Michael. Gaynor, you've also put something in the chat box. Would you like to say what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Michael was saying in terms of using language that people understand, not a clinical way of doing things, because it allows people to empower themselves to be able to sort of make those changes themselves, because they are in control of what they're doing, in terms of sort of understanding their triggers, what works best for those people. I've just put I've done some training around sort of suicide from a lady called Alice Cole King, and she's got a lot. She's based, I think she's Welsh. She's based in the UK, and she offers training to those professionals, etc. But there's also lots of other sort of resources available. Things like something called My Safety Plan, and it's looking at sort of it's looking at normal language about what is best for that person to support them in that need. So that's why I just wanted to share those resources with you.
Okay, thank you, Gaynor. Thank you. Georgie, you mentioned, would you like to tell us what the Maytree is? Because people may not be familiar.
Yeah, Maytree is a lovely suicide sanctuary that's like a home for people to come in for 4 nights, 5 days, and they just talk with people, and we all sit around and make food and eat together. So it's lovely. They're kind of getting one-on-one therapy time, so to speak, and it's a non-medical place in a home, and they've got one in Frinsbury Park, and they've got permission to open one in Manchester. So it's really nice, and it's a online phone call as well that they get. So yeah, Maytree's lovely. But can I just really quickly say one thing from why I think people think about dying so much? I think it's because in the 3D world, we have to make things certain. We only know through certainty to feel grounded. So I think because it's the uncertain, we try and find, if we are living very much in the 3D and we're not in the shamanistic perspective or the heat, or we don't regularly go into the energy healing worlds, it's like this scramble to try and figure out what death is. I just wanted to say that. I think it's a balance of certainty. Yeah, anyway, there we go.
Okay, thank you, Georgie. Martine has just left a note that she's had to leave to go to another meeting, and I am aware of the time. Carolyn, did you want to say something? Can you unmute? Okay.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. When I was a little girl, my mum died when I was 5. My dad had already died when I was 2. My mum died when I was 5. So I really can't remember about my dad at all, and very little about my mum. In fact, I think the only things I do remember about her is what really people have told me. And the lady who adopted me, who became my mum, I can remember, I always knew that she wasn't my real mum and my mum had died. But her story to me was that God only picked the best flowers for his garden. So that's why she'd gone, because she'd gone to be a flower in his garden. So as a child, what else was I going to think? And when I look back now, I can remember her telling me, she said, you were always talking to the flowers. I spent time in the garden talking to the flowers. And when I think, why didn't she pick up that a child who thought all of those flowers were people who passed on to some other world were now in our garden? and I was just chatting to them to keep them company. And now I think it's quite funny. You know, I mean, children talk to themselves all the time, have conversations, but she was at one time really concerned about it and mentioned it to the doctor. And I thought, well, if you'd been a bit more savvy, you would have known I was going and chatting to people who'd gone to a better place, our beautiful garden. It was just as a child, you know, so it's children's perspective. You know, when I've worked with children since myself who've lost someone, I can't even remember the name of the little book that I used to use with them, but it was about a dragonfly. And of course, dragonflies are underwater, aren't they? And when they get the wings, they come out and they can't go back into the water. And that's the story the dragonfly is telling them, you know. They're saying, if anybody leaves the water, will you come back and tell us what it's like? And they said, but we can't come back and tell each other what it's like because we'll have wings and we'll be flying outside and we can't come back into the water. It's a lovely little story, and I have used it many times, you know, given it to parents to talk to the children. But in my world, all them flowers out there, I can talk to them anytime, you know. That's my thing.
Thank you.
Never mind, Prince Charles.
Would you put that book, if you can remember the title, in the chat? And I'm really thankful for everybody's input. It's quite a complicated session.